So picture this. You're sitting in the most important meeting room in the galaxy. The Galactic Council chamber is buzzing with panic, and you've just received the worst news possible. The peaceful Zephyrian colony of New Haven, home to 12 million researchers and their families, is about to become the next meal for something called a Ravager swarm. Now, when I say these aren't your typical space troublemakers, I mean it. We're talking about bioengineered creatures that have turned planet consumption into an art form. They don't just attack worlds. They literally devour them, strip them clean, and then move on to the next cosmic buffet. The Zephyrians are basically the galaxy's gentle giants. Picture a whole civilization that decided thousands of years ago that violence was pointless and stupid. They threw away their weapons, dismantled their armies, and spent all their time studying stars, discovering new medicines, and writing beautiful poetry about nebulae. Sweet people, really. The kind of neighbors who'd water your plants while you're on vacation and never complain about loud music. But when something like the Ravager swarm shows up at your doorstep, being peaceful doesn't exactly help you much. The Council had tried everything they could think of, and I mean everything. They sent their best fleets, ships that cost more than entire star systems, crewed by the bravest warriors from dozens of different worlds. The Altarians sent their crystal battleships that could slice through asteroids like butter. The Centauri Federation deployed their famous shield walls that had never been broken in 3 centuries of warfare. The proud vegan empire brought their legendary plasma cannons that could melt moons. Want to know what happened to all of them? Gone. Not just destroyed, absorbed. The Ravager swarm has this terrifying ability to take whatever attacks them and make it part of themselves. Those beautiful crystal battleships, now they're part of the enemy fleet, turned into twisted versions of their former selves. Those brave crews, let's just say they're not coming home for dinner. Meanwhile, the Zephyrians could only watch in horror as their orbital defense platforms crumbled like stale cookies. These weren't military installations. They were basically fancy space umbrellas designed to keep out radiation and small asteroids. Against the Ravager swarm, they might as well have been made of tissue paper. The peaceful researchers huddled in their underground shelters, listening to the sounds of their beautiful floating cities, being torn apart piece by piece. So, what do you do when you're the Galactic Council, and you've just watched your most powerful militaries get turned into cosmic soup? When every strategy you've tried has failed spectacularly. When you're facing something that treats your best weapons like appetizers, you do something that's never been done before in galactic history. You swallow your pride and send out a desperate message to everyone and anyone who might be listening. The distress call went out across every communication channel they had. Emergency frequencies, diplomatic channels, even old trading routes that hadn't been used in decades. It was basically a cosmic SOS that said, "Help us, we're completely out of ideas, and 12 million innocent people are about to die." Not exactly the kind of message that makes you look strong and in control, but when you're facing extinction, pride becomes a luxury you can't afford. Most civilizations did exactly what you'd expect. They pretended they never received a message. The Andromedan Empire suddenly became very interested in exploring distant galaxies. The Tau Ceti Alliance discovered urgent business on the other side of the galaxy. Even the usually helpful Proxima Confederation mysteriously went silent. Nobody wanted to face something that had just chewed through the Council's combined military, might like it was nothing. But way out on the galactic rim, in a quiet little corner that most advanced civilizations considered barely worth noticing, sat a small yellow star with a bunch of rocky planets orbiting around it. Third planet from the sun, covered in blue oceans and white clouds, lived a young species that had only figured out faster-than-light travel a few decades ago. Most of the galaxy considered them primitive newcomers, barely evolved past hitting things with sticks, as some snooty diplomats liked to joke. These humans picked up that distress call, and their reaction was completely different from everyone else's. While the rest of the galaxy saw an unstoppable force of nature, something beyond understanding or defeat, the humans looked at the tactical data and saw something else entirely. They saw patterns. They saw weaknesses. Most importantly, they saw a problem that needed solving, and humans have always been really, really good at solving problems, especially the kind that everyone else says can't be solved. That's when things got interesting. Here's where it gets really interesting, and honestly a little scary. Within just a few hours of receiving that desperate message from the Galactic Council, something incredible happened on Earth. The entire human military machine started moving with a speed and precision that would have made other species very, very nervous if they'd been watching. But this wasn't your typical Hollywood movie moment with shiny spacecraft and heroic music. Oh no! What started emerging from hidden stations scattered throughout the solar system looked like it had been designed by something that understood exactly how dangerous the universe really was. These ships were angular and brutal-looking, covered in weapons that probably violated about half the galaxy's carefully written rules about ethical warfare. You know those international treaties that say you can't use certain types of weapons because they're too nasty? Well, humans apparently read those treaties as suggestions rather than rules. The vessels looked more like flying fortresses than the elegant, graceful ships that other civilizations preferred. While the Altarians built their ships to look like works of art, and the Centaurians designed theirs to showcase their advanced technology, humans had built theirs for one simple purpose: to win fights, no matter how ugly those fights got. The person in charge of this whole operation was General Blake Martinez, a woman who'd spent her entire career studying something that most peaceful civilizations had forgotten existed: the art of warfare. While other species have been busy exploring beautiful nebulae and writing poetry about the wonder of space travel, humans have been quietly perfecting the science of conflict. Martinez wasn't some hot-headed military leader looking for glory. She was methodical, careful, and absolutely terrifying in her ability to break down complex problems into manageable pieces. Here's what made the human approach so different from everyone else who tried to fight the Ravagers. Every other civilization had treated them like some kind of unstoppable natural disaster, like a cosmic hurricane that you just had to survive. They'd thrown their biggest guns at the problem, sent their bravest warriors, and hoped for the best. When that didn't work, they'd tried bigger guns and braver warriors. It was like trying to stop a tsunami by throwing rocks at it. But the humans, they did something that nobody else had even thought to try. They studied the Ravagers like scientists studying a new species of insect. While the Council's military leaders were planning heroic charges and desperate last stands, human researchers were mapping out Ravager breeding cycles, social structures, feeding patterns, communication methods, and behavioral tendencies. They treated it like a biology project, not a military campaign. Human scientists spent weeks analyzing every piece of combat footage they could get their hands on. They studied the wreckage of destroyed Council ships, examined energy signatures from Ravager weapons, and even analyzed the chemical composition of planets the swarm had previously consumed. They approached the problem like they were trying to understand how to control a pest infestation, not fight an honorable war. And that's when they discovered something that changed everything. The Ravagers weren't actually trying to destroy civilizations. They were farming them. Think about it like this. A farmer doesn't just randomly destroy crops. They cultivate them, tend to them, and harvest them when the time is right. The Ravagers have been doing the same thing with entire civilizations, but instead of growing corn or wheat, they were growing fear, desperation, and panic. They would show up at a peaceful world and start with small attacks, just enough to get everyone scared. Then they'd back off and let that fear spread and grow. They'd attack supply lines, destroy communication networks, and eliminate military defenses piece by piece, always leaving just enough hope that resistance might be possible. They were essentially marinating entire civilizations in terror before moving in for the final harvest. Once the humans realized this, everything changed. General Martinez looked at her team of strategists and said something that probably would have made the peaceful Galactic Council species very uncomfortable. If we're fighting farmers, then we need to stop thinking like soldiers and start thinking like exterminators. The human fleet that assembled wasn't designed for honor or glory. It was designed for efficiency. Every ship carried weapons and equipment specifically chosen not to fight the Ravagers in fair combat, but to disrupt their entire biological and social system. They brought viral agents designed to interfere with Ravager communication networks, electromagnetic weapons that could scramble their coordination signals, and most importantly, they brought the kind of ruthless, scientific approach to warfare that treated the enemy not as worthy opponents, but as a problem to be solved permanently. While other species prepare for battle, humans prepare for controlled elimination. When the human fleet finally arrived at the Zephyr system, something really interesting happened. Or rather, something didn't happen. The Ravager swarm, these massive bioengineered predators that had just finished crushing the galaxy's most powerful militaries, barely even registered the newcomers. Can you imagine that level of arrogance? It's like a pack of wolves being so focused on their meal that they don't notice the pest control van pulling up outside. These bioships were absolutely massive. We're talking about living vessels that were part spaceship, part creature, each one the size of a city. They were fat and content, having gorged themselves on the energy from destroyed council fleets. Their hulls pulsed with a sickly organic rhythm, like gigantic hearts beating in the vacuum of space. They'd been preparing for what they considered the final victory feast, the complete consumption of New Haven and its 12 million terrified inhabitants. The most terrifying thing about the Ravager swarm wasn't just their size or their weapons. It was their leader, the alpha creature that controlled the entire fleet. Picture this. Something the size of a small moon, but it wasn't made of rock and ice like a normal celestial body. This thing was alive, a writhing mass of interconnected organisms that shared a single, vast consciousness. Millions upon millions of smaller creatures, all thinking as one, all part of a single, hungry mind that had consumed countless worlds across the galaxy. When this massive intelligence first detected the human ships, it felt something it hadn't experienced in thousands of years: curiosity. Not fear, not concern, just mild interest. It was like a giant looking down and noticing some ants had wandered into its yard. The alpha creature had seen this pattern before. Desperate civilizations sending their last, pathetic military forces in hopeless final gestures. It had absorbed so many final stands and desperate last hopes that they become routine, almost boring. But the humans did something completely unexpected. They didn't charge in with weapons blazing and war cries echoing across communication channels. They didn't attempt some dramatic, heroic assault that would make for great stories later. Instead, they did something that must have looked absolutely bizarre to both the Ravagers and the watching Zephyrians. They scattered throughout the entire star system, like seeds being planted in a garden. Some ships took positions near asteroid belts. Others moved close to the system's outer planets. And a few even positioned themselves near the local star. It looked random, almost chaotic, like they had no plan at all. The Ravager swarm's tactical analysis systems couldn't make sense of it. Where was the concentrated attack force? Where were the heroic speeches about duty and honor? Where was the desperate, all-or-nothing assault that every other species had attempted? Down on New Haven's surface, the Zephyrian survivors were huddled in their underground shelters, monitoring every communication channel they could access. They'd been hoping for salvation, for some kind of heroic rescue that would save their families and their beautiful world. Instead, they started listening to human military communications, and honestly, what they heard made them more scared than they'd been when the Ravagers first arrived. The humans talked about warfare like they were discussing a science experiment. Officers calmly discussed acceptable loss percentages and collateral damage parameters, in the same tone you might use to talk about what to have for lunch. There were no passionate speeches about justice or freedom, no emotional declarations about protecting the innocent, just cold, clinical discussions about tactics, timing, and statistical probabilities. One Zephyrian communications specialist later said it was like listening to doctors discussing surgery, except the patient was an entire star system, and the doctor seemed perfectly comfortable with the idea that some parts might not survive the operation. These humans weren't treating this as a glorious battle between good and evil. They were treating it as a pest control problem that needed to be solved efficiently and permanently. When the Ravager swarm finally decided to deal with these annoying newcomers, they expected the usual pattern. Small ships would make desperate attacks. Humans would die heroically, and then the swarm would absorb whatever was useful from their technology and biomass. It was a script that had played out hundreds of times across the galaxy. But then the humans revealed their hand, and everything changed. They hadn't come to fight ship-to-ship battles or engage in honorable combat. They'd spent all that time scattering throughout the system to deploy something far more sophisticated and terrifying. Custom-engineered biological agents specifically designed to target the Ravager's greatest strength and turn it into their greatest weakness. The swarm's shared consciousness, that vast neural network that connected millions of organisms across hundreds of bioships, suddenly became a highway for destruction. Engineered viruses, created by human scientists who understood both the beauty of creation and the necessity of controlled destruction, began spreading to bioships' interconnected systems faster than the swarm could adapt or defend against them. For the first time in millennia, the alpha creature felt something it had never experienced before: genuine fear. What happened next could barely be called a battle. If you want to be honest about it, calling it a battle was being way too generous to the Ravager swarm. It was more like watching a team of expert surgeons methodically removing a massive, dangerous tumor from a patient's body. The whole thing took exactly 18 hours and 23 minutes, and every single minute was carefully planned and executed with the kind of precision that would make a Swiss watchmaker jealous. The engineered viruses that the humans had deployed didn't just attack the Ravagers randomly. They were specifically designed to target the swarm's greatest advantage and flip it into their greatest weakness. Remember, these creatures shared a massive neural network that connected every single organism across hundreds of bioships. It was like having millions of brains all connected to the same internet, sharing thoughts and coordinating attacks instantly across vast distances. Well, the humans had basically turned that internet into a weapon. The viruses spread through the neural links faster than the swarm could even understand what was happening. Imagine if every computer in a network suddenly started attacking every other computer in that same network. The bioships began writhing in space like wounded animals, their own weapon systems turning against neighboring vessels. Ships that had fought together for centuries were suddenly firing on each other, their targeting systems corrupted and their coordination completely scrambled. The alpha creature, that massive intelligence the size of a small moon, found itself fighting a war on millions of fronts simultaneously. Every connection that had once made it stronger was now a pathway for destruction. It was like having your own nervous system rebel against you, except magnified across an entire fleet of living warships. Meanwhile, the human fleet moved through the chaos with surgical precision. They weren't there to engage in dramatic space battles or prove their courage in single combat. They had a job to do, and they were doing it with the methodical efficiency of professionals who had studied their craft for decades. Some ships focused on containment, making sure no infected Ravager vessels could escape the system and spread the engineered virus to other swarm colonies. Others moved in to capture specimens, carefully selecting which bioships to preserve for later study. It was absolutely terrifying to watch, according to few council observers who arrived near the end. The humans treated the dismantling of this ancient threat like they were conducting a large-scale scientific experiment. They took detailed readings, collected samples, and documented everything with the kind of obsessive attention to detail that suggested they were already planning for the next time they might face something similar. The alpha creature, in its final moments of coherent thought, managed to send out one last transmission across all Ravager communication frequencies. It wasn't a call for help or a desperate battle cry. It was a warning, broadcast to any other Ravager colonies that might be listening across the galaxy. The message was simple but chilling. Beware the quiet destroyers from the rim worlds. They did not fight like prey. They kill with the patience of thinking predators. Then the massive intelligence that had terrorized the galaxy for millennia simply stopped. The great bioship went dark. Its millions of interconnected organisms finally severed from the neural network that had given them purpose. The most feared predator in known space had been neutralized not through heroic sacrifice or superior firepower, but through careful study and applied science. But the humans weren't finished yet. While the space battle was winding down, ground forces were already deploying to New Haven's surface to deal with the Ravager creatures that had already landed on the planet. The Zephyrian survivors, emerging from their underground shelters after days of terror, expected to see traditional soldiers, warriors who would hunt down the remaining enemies with courage and determination. What they actually encountered was something much more unsettling. These human soldiers moved through their cities with disturbing efficiency, treating urban warfare like a complex three-dimensional puzzle that needed to be solved completely and permanently. They didn't just chase down the remaining Ravagers. They systematically mapped every location the creatures had visited, analyzed every surface they had touched, and cataloged every potential contamination site. The humans established quarantine zones around everything, not just areas where active fighting had occurred, but anywhere a Ravager might have left biological traces. They worked with an obsessive thoroughness that made it very clear to the watching Zephyrians that leaving any threat partially neutralized was personally offensive to these people. Every building was scanned, every water source was tested, and every piece of potentially contaminated material was either sterilized or safely contained. Watching human soldiers work was like watching extremely dedicated scientists who happened to carry weapons. They documented everything, collected samples of everything, and approached each tactical situation like they were solving an equation rather than fighting for their lives. The Zephyrians had asked for heroes to save them, but what they got were professionals who treated the complete elimination of threats as both an art and a science. By the time the last Ravager ground forces had been neutralized, it was clear that humanity's approach to warfare was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen before. When the Galactic Council fleets finally arrived at the Zephyr system to survey what had happened, they brought with them the finest military analysts, xenobiologists, and strategic experts from dozens of different worlds. These were beings who had studied warfare for centuries, who had witnessed the rise and fall of entire civilizations, and who thought they understood every possible way that conflicts could unfold across the galaxy. They came expecting to find the usual aftermath of a desperate battle. Wreckage scattered across space, heroic last stands, maybe a few human survivors to rescue and honor for their brave sacrifice. What they actually found made them so deeply uncomfortable that some of the Council observers had to take breaks from their analysis just to process what they were seeing. The humans hadn't just defeated the Ravager swarm, which would have been impressive enough. They hadn't just driven them away or scattered their forces, which would have been more than anyone had dared to hope for. They had performed what could only be described as a controlled extinction, a complete, systematic elimination of the entire threat, while somehow preserving exactly the right specimens for detailed scientific study. Picture walking into a laboratory where someone had just finished the most complex dissection in galactic history. Every piece of Ravager biotechnology was cataloged, organized, and stored with the kind of meticulous care usually reserved for priceless archaeological treasures. The humans had managed to eliminate an ancient terror that had plagued the galaxy for millennia, while simultaneously conducting what appeared to be the most comprehensive xenobiological research project anyone had ever attempted. The level of victory was so absolute that it was genuinely unsettling to witness. There weren't just a few destroyed bioships floating in space. There was a complete systematic dismantling that had been executed with surgical precision. Every single Ravager vessel had been either completely neutralized or carefully preserved for study. Every ground-based creature had been tracked down and dealt with. Every potential contamination site had been identified and sterilized. It was a kind of thoroughness that suggested the humans hadn't just been fighting for their lives. They'd been conducting a scientific experiment on a galactic scale. Down on New Haven's surface, the Zephyrian survivors gathered to offer their thanks to the species that had answered their desperate call for help. Their gratitude was absolutely genuine. These people had been facing certain death, and the humans had saved not just their lives, but their entire civilization. But there was something new in their voices, a wariness that hadn't been there when they first sent out their plea for assistance. They had asked the galaxy for saviors, for heroic warriors who would ride to their rescue in humanity's darkest hour. What they had received was something far more complex and, honestly, more frightening than they'd expected. These weren't the noble, honor-bound warriors that populated their children's stories. These were liberators who approached violence with the same systematic precision that their own species applied to studying distant stars. The humans had saved them, absolutely, but they'd done it in a way that revealed something about human nature that made even grateful survivors feel a little nervous. General Blake Martinez stood on the observation deck of her flagship, watching her crews work with the same methodical efficiency they'd shown during the actual operation. Teams of scientists and engineers were carefully cataloging every piece of Ravager biotechnology like they were handling precious artifacts from an ancient civilization, which, in a way, they were, except these particular artifacts had been trying to eat an entire star system just a few hours earlier. Martinez knew that something fundamental had shifted, not just in the star system, but in how the entire galaxy would view humanity from this point forward. Her species had answered a cry for help from strangers on the other side of the galaxy, and in doing so, they had revealed a truth about themselves that would echo across civilizations for generations to come. Other species approached warfare as a necessary evil or as a test of honor and courage. Humans had somehow managed to turn it into peer-reviewed science, constantly improving their methods with each encounter. Every battle humans fought, every conflict they engaged in, became data for the next confrontation. They studied their enemies not just to defeat them, but to understand them so completely that future victories would be even more efficient. It was like having predators who went to graduate school and wrote dissertations about hunting techniques. The Galactic Council representatives would return to their home worlds with reports that would fundamentally change how the galaxy viewed this young species from the Outer Rim. Earth's inhabitants weren't the savage beasts that some civilizations had assumed they were. They weren't primitive warriors who relied on brute force and luck. They were thinking predators who got better at hunting with every single fight, who accumulated knowledge like other species collected art, and who would respond to any future cry for help armed with the combined wisdom of every monster they had ever faced, studied, and systematically defeated. The galaxy had just learned that when humans answer calls for help, they brought more than just weapons and courage. They brought the accumulated experience of a species that had turned survival into both an art and a science. And that was a lesson the universe wouldn't soon forget.